Let me tell you a story that started with hope, but quickly turned into something I never expected. When my husband Ryan and I bought our home in Willow Creek Estates, it felt like we'd won the lottery. The neighborhood was beautiful, wide open spaces, trees swaying gently in the breeze, and neighbors who always seemed friendly. It wasn't just a house, it was a dream come true. We finally had enough land to bring Bubba, our prize bull, home with us. Now let me tell you about Bubba, because he wasn't just any ordinary animal. He was special. People called him the gentle giant because despite his massive size, he had the softest brown eyes and the calmest demeanor. Bubba wasn't just a pet, he was family. He'd won awards at local fairs, been featured in magazines, and even helped out at charity events for kids. Everyone loved him. Well, almost everyone. At first, life in Willow Creek seemed perfect. Neighbors stopped by to admire Bubba. Kids giggled as they watched him munch on grass, and everything felt peaceful. But then, things began to change. One afternoon, while I was watering flowers near the fence, I noticed Margaret Hensley walking briskly toward me. If you've ever met someone who looks like they're perpetually annoyed, that's Margaret. She's the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. And trust me, she takes her role very seriously. "Good afternoon," I said, trying to sound cheerful. She didn't smile back. Instead, she held up her clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. "We need to talk about your cow," she said sharply. "My cow asterisk." I repeated, confused. "Yes, your cow, or should I say, your bovine nuisance. He's causing problems." I laughed nervously, thinking she must be joking. Bubba, a problem. That didn't make sense. But then she showed me pictures. Crushed flower beds, broken fence posts, muddy hoof prints all over someone's driveway. At first glance, it looked bad. Really bad. But there was no way Bubba could have done all that. He mostly stayed within our property line. Or so I thought. Margaret's voice grew colder. "This isn't acceptable. You need to get this under control immediately." I promised her I'd look into it, but inside, I felt uneasy. Something about the way she spoke made me realize this wasn't going to end easily. Later that evening, Ryan and I talked about it. "Maybe we can reinforce the fences," he suggested, "or keep Bubba in a smaller area during the day." It sounded reasonable, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret wasn't going to let this go. And sure enough, 2 days later, another letter appeared under our door. This time, it wasn't polite or vague. It was an ultimatum. "You have 48 hours to remove the bovine nuisance from your property or face immediate consequences," it read. Consequences. What did that even mean? I tried calling Margaret to discuss it, hoping to find a solution. But when I reached her, her tone sent chills down my spine. "This isn't negotiable," she said firmly. "If you don't deal with him, we will." Her words haunted me. Who talks like that? What exactly did she plan to do? For the rest of the day, I kept glancing outside, half expecting her to march onto our property with some kind of enforcement team. Ryan reassured me, saying, "Don't worry. There are rules protecting livestock. She can't just do whatever she wants." But as the hours ticked by, doubt crept in. Margaret didn't strike me as someone who cared much about rules unless they worked in her favor. And little did I know, her next move would leave me reeling and change everything forever. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. Margaret's ultimatum weighed heavily on my mind. 48 hours wasn't much time, especially when it came to figuring out what to do with Bubba. He wasn't just an animal you could pack up and move like furniture. He was part of our lives, and the thought of losing him, or worse, was unbearable. I decided to take action. First, I called around to see if there were any nearby farms or sanctuaries that might temporarily take Bubba until things cooled down. But every option came with complications. Some places didn't have space. Others charged fees we couldn't afford. It felt like hitting one dead end after another. Meanwhile, Ryan suggested we double-check our property lines to make sure Bubba hadn't wandered off without us noticing. So, armed with measuring tape and stakes, we spent the afternoon inspecting the perimeter. To our relief, the fences were intact. Well, mostly. There was one spot where the posts looked slightly loose, but it wasn't enough for Bubba to squeeze through. Still, we patched it up just to be safe. As the sun began to set, I stood by the fence, watching Bubba graze peacefully. His tail swished lazily as he chewed on tufts of grass, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. My heart sank. How could anyone look at him and think he was a menace? He was gentle, harmless, even helpful in his own way. His manure made excellent fertilizer for our garden, and his presence brought joy to everyone who visited. Why couldn't Margaret see that? That evening, we attended an HOA meeting, hoping to plead our case directly to the board. The room was packed with neighbors, some curious, others hostile. Margaret sat at the front, her usual stern expression plastered across her face. As soon as the meeting started, she launched into a tirade about problem properties and disruptive residents. It didn't take long to realize she was talking about us. "This isn't just about aesthetics," she declared, slamming her palm on the table for emphasis. "It's about safety and accountability. We cannot allow dangerous animals to roam freely. What happens when someone gets hurt?" Her words sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. A few people nodded in agreement, while others avoided eye contact altogether. I raised my hand hesitantly, waiting to be acknowledged. When Margaret finally called on me, I spoke as calmly as I could. "Bubba hasn't hurt anyone," I said. "He stays within our property line, and we're working to reinforce the fencing. Can't we find a compromise here?" Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. "Compromise?" she echoed, her voice dripping with disdain. "Your bull has already caused thousands of dollars in damages. Do you plan to pay for all of that, or will the rest of us foot the bill?" Her accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it was unfair. Yes, there were minor issues, trampled flowers, a bent fence post, but nothing close to the catastrophic scenario she painted. I glanced around the room, searching for support, but most people looked away, unwilling to challenge her. By the time the meeting ended, I felt defeated. Margaret had successfully turned the narrative against us, framing Bubba as a threat rather than the beloved creature he truly was. On the drive home, Ryan tried to cheer me up. "Don't let her get to you," he said. "We'll figure this out." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Margaret's threats lingered in my mind like a dark cloud. She'd given us 48 hours, and we were running out of options. If we couldn't resolve the situation, what would happen next? Would they really come onto our property and take matters into their own hands? The thought terrified me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside, made me jump. I kept imagining Margaret showing up with some kind of enforcement team, ready to drag Bubba away. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the same trusting gaze that had greeted me every morning since we brought him home. By dawn, exhaustion had taken over, but the anxiety remained. I stepped outside to check on Bubba one last time before heading back inside to brainstorm more solutions. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come, and Margaret was about to cross a line no one could ignore. The morning arrived with a heaviness in the air, like the calm before a storm. I was already outside, sipping coffee and watching Bubba graze near the fence. He looked so peaceful, his massive frame swaying slightly as he chewed on the dewy grass. It was hard to imagine anyone seeing him as anything other than what he was, a gentle giant. But Margaret's ultimatum loomed over us, and every passing hour felt like a countdown to disaster. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. Thinking it might be another neighbor stopping by to check on Bubba, or worse, someone from the HOA, I hurried inside. When I opened the door, though, it wasn't Margaret or any of her cronies. It was Mr. Peterson, an older man who lived 2 properties down. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of his hat. "You need to come quick," he said, his voice shaky. "There's been an incident." My heart sank. Ryan heard the urgency in Mr. Peterson's tone and joined me at the doorway. Without another word, we followed him outside, our feet crunching against the gravel path leading toward the edge of our property. As we rounded the corner, the scene unfolded before us, and my world stopped. Bubba lay motionless on the ground, his once powerful body now lifeless. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the earth a dark crimson. Nearby, holding a rifle slung casually over her shoulder, stood Margaret. Her expression was eerily calm, as if she hadn't just done something unimaginable. "What did you do?" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. My legs felt weak, but anger surged through me, propelling me forward. Ryan grabbed my arm, holding me back before I could lunge at her. "He was destroying private property," Margaret said matter-of-factly, her voice devoid of emotion. "I warned you, didn't I?" Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some gasped in horror, others whispered among themselves. One woman covered her mouth with her hand, while a man shook his head disapprovingly. No one stepped forward to defend Margaret. Not that I expected them to. But no one came to comfort us either. They just stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Ryan pulled me aside, his grip firm but gentle. "We can't let her see how much this hurts us," he murmured. "Not now. We'll deal with this later." But dealing with it later seemed impossible. How could anyone move past something like this? Bubba wasn't just an animal. He was part of our family. And now, because of Margaret's reckless actions, he was gone forever. As the initial shock wore off, reality began to sink in. Margaret had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She hadn't called animal control or sought legal advice. She'd taken matters into her own hands, wielding a weapon like some kind of self-appointed enforcer. What gave her the right? Who did she think she was? That evening, after most of the neighbors had dispersed and the authorities had been notified, Ryan and I sat together on the porch, staring at the empty field where Bubba used to roam. The silence was deafening. For the first time since moving to Willow Creek, I felt truly alone. But amidst the grief and anger, a spark of determination ignited within me. Margaret may have thought she could silence us, but she underestimated one crucial thing: the law. Killing an animal, especially under these circumstances, wasn't something she could brush off easily. There had to be consequences for what she'd done. For Bubba, for us, and for everyone else living under the shadow of her tyranny. And as I sat there, clutching Ryan's hand tightly, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't going to end here. Not like this. The days that followed Bubba's death were a blur of grief and anger. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and could barely look at the field where he used to graze without breaking down. But as much as I wanted to curl up and let the sadness consume me, something inside refused to give up. Margaret thought she had won, that she'd silenced us with her actions, but she didn't know who she was dealing with. I started digging, not in the ground, but into laws, statutes, and anything else that might help me understand what rights we had. If Margaret believed she could get away with shooting Bubba, she was wrong. There had to be rules protecting animals like him. Rules she clearly ignored when she pulled the trigger. That's when I stumbled upon something important: state agricultural codes. In our area, livestock classified as agricultural assets were protected under specific conditions. These weren't just random farm animals. They were considered valuable contributions to the community, especially if they were registered or used for educational purposes. And Bubba, he checked every box. He was registered insured and even brought recognition to Willow Creek through his awards and appearances. According to the law, harming an animal like Bubba without proper legal process wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. Armed with this information, I reached out to Claire, an old friend from college who happened to be a lawyer. When I explained everything over the phone, her tone shifted from sympathetic to sharp and focused. "This is huge. she said after hearing about Bubba's status and Margaret's actions. If what you're saying is true, she's violated multiple laws. This isn't just about property damage anymore. It's criminal negligence. Claire agreed to help, and together, we began gathering evidence. Photos of Bubba's awards, registration papers, testimony from neighbors who knew how gentle he was. All of it painted a clear picture of the injustice we were fighting against. We also collected statements from other residents who had dealt with Margaret's heavy-handed tactics, hoping to show a pattern of abuse beyond just our case. But it wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like wading through mud. Some neighbors were too scared to speak up, fearing retaliation from Margaret or the HOA board. Others simply didn't want to get involved, muttering excuses about staying neutral. Still, there were a few brave souls who came forward, sharing stories of fines they couldn't afford, threats of foreclosure, and public humiliation during meetings. Their courage gave me strength, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this fight. As the pieces fell into place, Ryan and I decided to take things further. We created flyers and posted them around the neighborhood, urging people to join us in standing up to the HOA. At first, response was slow, but then something incredible happened. A local news station picked up the story. The headline read, "HOA President takes matters into her own hands, shoots neighbor's prize bull." Within hours, the article went viral, sparking outrage online and drawing attention to the broader issues plaguing Willow Creek. Margaret tried to defend herself, releasing a statement claiming she acted in the interest of safety. But no one bought it. People saw through her excuses, especially when photos of Bubba surfaced, his gentle eyes, his blue ribbons, his undeniable charm. The more the story spread, the more support we gained. Neighbors who had once been silent started reaching out, offering their help and solidarity. By the end of the week, we weren't just fighting for justice for Bubba, we were fighting for everyone who had ever felt powerless under Margaret's rule. And though the pain of losing him still lingered, I knew we were on the right path. Margaret had underestimated us, and now she was about to face consequences far greater than she ever imagined. The momentum was building, and it felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Word of Bubba's story and Margaret's actions spread faster than we could have anticipated. People who had once kept their heads down and avoided conflict were now stepping forward, eager to share their own frustrations with the HOA. It wasn't just about Bubba anymore. It was about years of pent-up resentment toward Margaret's iron-fisted leadership. Ryan and I organized a meeting in our backyard one evening, inviting neighbors who wanted to discuss next steps. To our surprise, nearly 30 people showed up, some with lawn chairs, others perched on picnic blankets. The air buzzed with quiet conversations as everyone settled in. For the first time, I saw unity among us, a shared determination to stand up against something that had gone unchecked for far too long. Claire, our lawyer friend, led the discussion. She explained the legal grounds we had against Margaret, emphasizing how her actions violated not only state agricultural codes but also basic property rights. "This isn't just about one incident," she said firmly. "It's about accountability. If we don't push back now, nothing will change." One by one, neighbors began sharing their experiences. A young couple recounted how Margaret fined them $500 for painting their front door a shade of blue not approved by the HOA. An elderly woman spoke about being threatened with foreclosure when she fell behind on dues after medical bills wiped out her savings. Even Mr. Peterson, who had initially seemed hesitant to get involved, admitted he'd been pressured into removing his vegetable garden because it disrupted the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Each story added fuel to the fire, strengthening our resolve. Together, we formed a group called Willow Creek Justice. Our mission was clear: hold Margaret accountable for her actions and push for reforms within the HOA to ensure this kind of abuse never happened again. We didn't stop there. Flyers went up around the community, urging residents to attend the next HOA meeting. Social media played a huge role, too. We created a private Facebook group where people could share updates, organize protests, and offer support. Within days, hundreds of members joined, many posting screenshots of emails or letters they'd received from Margaret over the years. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. When the day of the HOA meeting arrived, the clubhouse was packed. Neighbors filled every seat, while reporters lingered outside, cameras ready to capture whatever unfolded. Margaret walked in late, flanked by 2 board members. Her usual confident stride faltered as she took in the crowd. For the first time, she looked uncertain, even nervous. The meeting started with routine announcements, but it didn't take long for things to escalate. When Margaret tried to brush off questions about Bubba's death, citing safety concerns, the room erupted. Voices rose in protest, demanding answers. Claire stood up, calm but commanding, and laid out our case point by point. She presented photos, documents, and testimonies, making it impossible for Margaret to deny the truth. Margaret's defense crumbled under scrutiny. Every excuse she offered was met with counterarguments backed by facts. By the end of the meeting, it was clear she had no leg to stand on. As the session adjourned, I noticed something remarkable. Neighbors exchanging phone numbers, planning future gatherings, and vowing to stay united. What had started as a personal tragedy had sparked a movement, one that promised lasting change. For the first time since losing Bubba, I felt a glimmer of hope. Margaret may have thought she was untouchable, but she underestimated the power of a community coming together. And now, the real battle was about to begin. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Neighbors filled every available seat, their faces a mix of anger, anticipation, and quiet hope. Reporters lined the back of the room, scribbling notes and snapping photos. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, her usual polished appearance replaced by something more subdued. She fidgeted with her bracelet, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. For once, she wasn't the one in control. Claire stood at the front, calm and composed, as she presented our case to the judge. She started with Bubba, his awards, his gentle nature, and his importance to our family and community. This wasn't just an animal, she said, her voice steady but firm. He was a registered agricultural asset, protected under state law. Shooting him without due process wasn't just reckless, it was illegal. She then moved on to the evidence we gathered. Photos of Bubba's registration papers, testimonials from neighbors about his harmless behavior, and documentation proving he hadn't caused any real harm beyond minor cosmetic damage. Claire emphasized that even if there had been legitimate concerns, and there weren't, Margaret bypassed every legal avenue to address them. Instead, she took matters into her own hands, wielding a rifle like some kind of self-appointed enforcer. When it was Margaret's turn to defend herself, her arguments fell flat almost immediately. Her lawyer tried to paint Bubba as a dangerous threat, claiming he posed a risk to public safety. But when asked for proof of injuries or serious property damage, they had nothing substantial to offer. The crushed flower beds and bent fence posts. Minor inconveniences, not life-threatening hazards. Margaret herself stumbled through her testimony, growing increasingly defensive as Claire questioned her. "Did you contact animal control before taking action?" Claire asked. "No," Margaret admitted reluctantly. "Did you file a formal complaint with local authorities?" "No." "Did you attempt to resolve the issue through mediation or any other legal means?" Again, the answer was no. Each question chipped away at her credibility. Exposing the truth, she acted out of frustration, not necessity. Her so-called concern for safety was just an excuse to justify her actions, a thinly veiled attempt to maintain control over the neighborhood. As the hearing progressed, the judge's expression grew increasingly stern. By the time closing statements rolled around, it was clear where things were headed. Claire wrapped up our argument with a powerful statement. "This isn't just about one bull. It's about accountability. If we allow individuals to take the law into their own hands, we set a dangerous precedent. Justice must be served, not only for my clients but for everyone who deserves to live free from fear and intimidation. Margaret's lawyer struggled to counter, offering weak platitudes about protecting property values and maintaining order. But his words lacked conviction, and the damage was already done. When the judge finally spoke, his tone left no room for ambiguity. "Ms. Hensley," he began, staring directly at her, "your actions were unjustified and unlawful. You disregarded protocol, ignored your responsibilities as a community leader, and violated laws designed to protect both people and animals. Restitution will be paid, and further consequences may follow based on the findings of this court." The room erupted in murmurs as Margaret slumped in her seat, visibly shaken. Outside, reporters swarmed us, asking for comments. Neighbors cheered and hugged each other, many openly crying tears of relief. For the first time in years, it felt like the balance of power had shifted. Margaret wasn't untouchable anymore, and neither was the HOA. That night, Ryan and I sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. The weight of the past few weeks still lingered, but there was also a sense of peace. We hadn't brought Bubba back, but we had honored his memory by standing up for what was right. And in doing so, we'd given a voice to everyone who had ever felt silenced. The fight wasn't over yet, but we were closer than ever to real change. Months passed, and Willow Creek began to feel like a different place. The changes weren't immediate, but they were undeniable. Margaret resigned as HOA president shortly after the court ruling and quietly moved away, unable to face the shame or scrutiny. Her departure left a void, but it also created an opportunity, a chance for the neighborhood to redefine itself. The HOA board underwent a complete overhaul. Neighbors who had once been too intimidated to speak up now stepped forward to take leadership roles. Carol, our kind-hearted next-door neighbor, became the new president. She promised transparency, fairness, and collaboration, values that had been sorely missing under Margaret's reign. Monthly meetings transformed from tense lectures into open discussions where everyone's voice mattered. One of the first orders of business was reforming the HOA rules. Gone were the nitpicky guidelines about mailbox colors and flower arrangements. Instead, the focus shifted to practical concerns: improving safety, maintaining shared spaces, and fostering a sense of community. People started organizing events again: barbecues, block parties, even a small farmers market where local growers could sell fresh produce. Laughter returned to the streets, replacing the tension that had lingered for so long. In memory of Bubba, we donated part of the settlement money to a nearby animal sanctuary. They named a pasture after him and erected a plaque that read, "Bubba, a gentle giant who inspired change." It wasn't just a tribute to him. It was a reminder of what he represented, a catalyst for justice and unity. Every time I visited the sanctuary, I felt a sense of peace knowing his legacy lived on in such a meaningful way. Life at home grew quieter without Bubba's presence, but his spirit remained with us. Ryan built a small memorial in the field where he used to graze, a simple wooden post with his name carved into it. On sunny afternoons, I'd sit there with a cup of tea, remembering how much joy he brought to our lives. Sometimes, when the wind rustled through the grass, I swore I could hear his low moo in the distance. Maybe it was my imagination, but it comforted me all the same. What struck me most was how this ordeal changed not just our neighborhood, but also its people. Those who had once kept to themselves now waved hello as they passed by. Conversations lasted longer, friendships deepened, and a sense of belonging replaced the isolation many had felt before. Even Mr. Peterson, who had initially seemed hesitant to get involved, became one of our closest allies. He often stopped by to share stories about his own childhood pets, saying, "Your bowl reminded me why animals matter." Looking back, I realized something important. Margaret may have thought she was untouchable, but she underestimated the power of community. When people come together with a shared purpose, they can overcome even the toughest challenges. Losing Bubba was devastating, but it taught us resilience and strength. It showed us that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Now, as I watch the sun set over our property, I feel grateful, not just for the changes in Willow Creek, but for the lessons we learned along the way. Margaret tried to silence us, but instead, she sparked a movement. And while nothing could ever replace Bubba, his story will forever remind us that even in loss, there is hope, and in hope, there is the power to create a better future. Willow Creek wasn't perfect anymore. It was something better. It was real.